Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's episode. Today, we're going to be exploring some really interesting topics. We're going to be talking about the fatal flaw of humility and what happens when misplaced humility comes into the picture. We're going to talk about what real leadership is about, what it means to be a strong leader, and not just leadership in terms of being a leader of a community, but also leadership within our own lives and how the ability to take true leadership impacts the way we face our everyday struggles and moral decisions. So we're going to be exploring all of this within the context of a famous story from the Gemara about the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash. Now, this is a famous story. You've likely heard of it before, but we're going to be taking a little bit of a different angle today. So it's the story of Kamtza and Bar Kamtza, which often the lesson which we pull out of that story, which the Gemara itself derives from the story, is about Sinas Chinam, baseless hatred, and the detriment of a community which isn't able to embrace each other full-heartedly. But there's another fatal flaw that the Gemara points to as leading to the destruction. And it comes at the very end of the story in a line that's often overlooked. And sometimes we forget to notice the importance and the weight of this flaw that the Gemara describes. So the context of the story, again, is the Second Temple era, and there's a lot of tensions rising in Israel at the time for under Roman rule. And the Gemara places in the context of this very tense political setting a party. And there's a host who hosts this party, and he invites many people to the party, including his friend Kamtza. But to his dismay, his enemy, Bar Kamtza, shows up to the party instead. At the party, as soon as he notices Bar Kamtza sitting there, the host immediately flies into a rage and says, "You need to leave this party right away." And Bar Kamtza begs and begs and pleads for the host to allow him to remain at the party. And the host rejects him and says, "No, you must leave." And he starts offering to pay for a portion of the party, even half the party, even the full cost of the party, if he would just allow him to stay. And the host very insensitively and cruelly does not allow Bar Kamtza to remain at the party. And the Gemara describes that the rabbis of the time were sitting at the party and they were silent. They did not protest to what was going on. And when Bar Kamtza left, he is so enraged by this experience that he goes straight to the Roman emperor and he tells the Roman emperor that the Jewish people are no longer faithful to him and he should be punishing them accordingly. And the Roman emperor says, "How do you know this?" And he says, "You'll see, try to send an offering to the temple, to the Beis Hamikdash, and you will see that the Jewish people will not offer it. And that is evidence of the fact that they no longer feel loyal to you." And the Roman emperor indeed sends an offering, and Bar Kamtza is a messenger who brings it to the Beis Hamikdash, and then along the way, he makes a small blemish on the face of the animal, and he makes a type of blemish which for the Romans, they wouldn't consider it invalid as an offering, but for us, halakhically, we would consider it invalid. And he thus invalidates the offering intentionally so that the Chachamim wouldn't agree to offer it in the Beis Hamikdash. And so he brings this karban, this calf, to the Beis Hamikdash. And when he arrives, he presents it to them. And right away, there's this huge debate that erupts, specifically between Reb Zechariah ben Avkilas and the rest of the Chachamim. And they are debating whether or not they should offer this calf. And they can foresee the fact that this is going to lead to the Roman emperor getting extremely upset and potentially lead to great destruction. So they know where this is going. And they're not sure what to do. So the sages are saying we need to offer it anyway, right? We know that halachically this normally would not be allowed to offer it on the Mizbeach, but right now, because of the situation we're in, this is like a life and death situation, we need to offer it anyway. And Reb Zechariah ben Avkulas says, well, people are going to say that you're allowed to offer a blemished animal on the Mizbeach if we offer it. So how can we offer it? And the Chachamim say, okay, well, if we don't want to do that, if we don't want to take the risk of people thinking that this type of animal is allowed to be offered, then we need to do something else to stop this from happening. And perhaps we need to give Bar Kamtza the death penalty, because he's clearly someone who is trying to bring about destruction to the Jewish people. And then Rav Tzcharia responds, he says, well, we can't do that either, because if we punish Bar Kamtza and we put him to death, people will think that the punishment for bringing this type of offering is, or someone who blemishes an offering is to be killed, and that's not the case. So we don't want people to think that. And they're having this debate back and forth, and in the end, they do nothing. And in the meantime, Bar Kamtza says, okay, looks like they're not offering the animal, and he, along with the Roman officers, return back to the Roman emperor and confirm that indeed the Jewish people were not willing to offer his calf on the Mizbeach. And the Gemara concludes with a really interesting statement. It says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan said, An vasnusei shel Zechariah ben Avkulas. It was the humility of Zechariah ben Avkulas that hachriva es beitenu, destroyed our Beis Hamikdash, our home, the sarfa es heichaleinu, and it burned our sanctuary, v'higlasanu mi'artzenu, and it exiled us from our land. Now, this is like a really interesting, dramatic accusation to make, right? We're almost seem to be implying that what was the reason for our destruction? It wasn't the host that was cruel to Bar Kamtza. It wasn't Bar Kamtza who came and tattled on the Jewish people to the Roman emperor. And it wasn't even the Romans themselves who came in and destroyed the Beis Hamikdash. No, it was the humility of Rav Zechariah ben Avkulas that brought about our destruction. Now, as dramatic as this accusation is how puzzling the word the Gemara uses to describe this fatal flaw. An vasnusei shel Zechariah, right? The humility of Rav Zechariah. So this is really puzzling, right? Humility is usually described, or we would imagine, is a really positive thing, right? This is praised as like one of the most prized qualities that a person can have in Yiddishkeit. So why would we be using humility as a way of identifying the fatal flaw in Rav Zechariah ben Avkulas's leadership? And also in the story itself, the word humility seems a little bit like inaccurate, right? Was it really humility? Was it like indecisiveness? Was it, being overly cautious? Like, what is the meaning of this word humility? So some of the classic commentators in the Gemara try to give an answer to this. So Rashi, on the word anvasnusei, he translated it as savlanusei, right? His tolerance, right? That he was too tolerant of Bar Kamtza and didn't take the bold undertaking to actually make a difficult decision that leaders have to make in difficult times, and just say, no, this is a time when we have to take bold action, and we have to either not offer this offering, even though it might look like we're doing something wrong, or even put Bar Kamtza to death in order to save the Jewish people. And that obviously was a bold decision to make, but that's something that we would expect of a leader. So he translates his humility as his tolerance, right? That he was too tolerant of Bar Kamtza. The Ben Yehoyada, which is another like classic commentary on the Gemara, written by the Ben Ish Chai, and he actually gives a little bit more historical context to this story. And that historical context, he explains, can sort of give us an understanding of this word. Why humility, right? What about what he did was too humble? So the Ben Yehoyada says that actually what happened was when the other Chachamim were coming to Rabbi Zechariah and saying, no, we should really just take bold action here and make a decision and make a call to, make a compromise in one area of halakha in order to save something that's much more precious. Rabbi Zechariah said, you're right, like that makes sense, but I don't want to make that call on my own. Let's go to the Sanhedrin and let the Sanhedrin make this decision. And if the Sanhedrin agrees that that's what we should do, then I will comply and I will go along with it as well. And what the Ben Yehoyada is basically implying is that the humility of Rabbi Zechariah was the fact that he didn't want to make the call on his own, right? He wanted to wait for the Sanhedrin to agree and to confirm this decision. And in the meantime, while he was too busy waiting for them to go to the Sanhedrin and get the confirmation, in the meantime, Bar Kamtza already took the calf and brought it back to the Roman emperor, and it was too late. And the humility was the fact that he wasn't able to have that confidence to say, I'm going to make a decision that I know is the right thing to do in this moment. And instead, because he was so humble and wanted to get confirmation from the Sanhedrin, that's when Bar Kamtza left and the whole thing was lost. So that's another way of understanding why specifically this fatal flaw of Reb Zachariah ben Avkulas was described as too much humility. But if we want to take this a little bit of a step further, right, and say maybe this story isn't just about, a single Jewish leader, what true leadership is about, and how we can, the necessity of a leader being able to make bold decisions on their own understanding when the moment calls for it, and not being afraid and not, being blinded by this, misplaced tolerance or patience. But maybe this is actually telling us something that really all of us, every single one of us, even those of us who aren't in stereotypical leadership positions, what does it look like for each of us in our own lives to take the message of the story? Like, what does it look like for all of us to take leadership and to take the message of the story in our everyday decisions? So there's a really interesting idea from the Pesach Einayim, which is written by the Chida, where he says that really the message of the story is that in any decision a person has to make, they always have to look at not just the immediate results, but what are the long-term effects, right? So often when we're making a decision, it's easy to get caught up in like the here and now. Like, what is this thing right or wrong right now? And somebody who's able, I guess what a true leader is able to do, and obviously on some level, each of us do within our own, when we're taking leadership in our own individual decisions, is being able to say, not just what's the impact of what I'm doing in this moment, but what's like the long-term impact, right? What is this going to mean down the line? And sometimes I have to make a temporary decision that seems like it's a step back because ultimately it's going to bring me much, much more forward. And that's what the Gemara is trying to convey to us with saying on Misplaced Zachariah that the humility of Reb Zachariah is what destroyed our Beis Hamikdash, is that the path of destruction for every individual person is always paved with decisions like this. Decisions where we are making a decision right now, only looking at what the immediate impact is, as opposed to looking at what's going to be the ultimate fallout down the line. But I want to focus now on another explanation. And this is an explanation of the Baal Shem Tov, which is discussed in Keser Shem Tov. And here, the Baal Shem Tov tries to, again, take this story and say that this really is a description of every single person in their own life. And he describes that when is humility a bad thing, right? Again, we know there's so much discussion in Chazal and all over Torah about how important and valuable humility is, right? That like Hashem could only reside in a place where there's humility, right? Arrogance is like the ultimate evil in Judaism. And yet, all of a sudden here, we're saying, no, that's like the fatal flaw. That's what led to the entire destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. And he says, what is this misplaced humility? When is humility this like the pathway to our destruction? It's when we don't have a confidence in the value of our own service of Hashem, right? Where we question ourselves and we wonder whether there's real value or real importance to the decisions that we're making. And I want to read a little bit of what he says here. So he says, "Me rave on Misplaced Adam, the great humility, the excessive humility that a person has, Gerim shenesrachik me'avedas Hashem Yisbarach, could actually lead him to become more distant from Hashem. Shemitzad shiflosai ini mamin ki adam gerim al yedi tefilase v'tirasai shefa al kol ha'elamais. That because of his own sense of loneliness, he assumes, or he doesn't believe, that his tefillah and his Torah, like his prayer and his learning, can actually cause this abundance of energy to flow into all of the worlds, even to the malachim themselves, right? The angels themselves, the zunei al yedei terasi v'tefillah, are actually sustained by his Torah and his tefillah. And he says, ilu mamin zeh, if he would believe this, Kama haya'eved Hashem b'simcha u'b'yira mirayv kol. His service of Hashem would be filled with so much joy and so much awe from the sense of confidence and joy in the fact that he's able to have that kind of impact. And he goes on to discuss this even more, and then he associates this with the story of Reb Zachariah ben Avkulas. And he says, just like that statement of the Gemara is really alluding to this notion that every single person has to embrace within their own Avaida in order for them to really be successful in the shores of Hashem. Now, this idea that the Baal Shem Tov talks about is an idea that is referenced in later discussions in Chassidus. And in one beautiful mimer, a Basi Lagani mimer of the Rebbe actually pulls on this idea from the Baal Shem Tov. And he says that, of course, we have to infer that if this fatal flaw of too much humility in the wrong way is what leads to the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, certainly counteracting that with a sense of real assertiveness and confidence in the real impact that our service of Hashem can have, that will, of course, have the opposite effect and actually enable us to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash, right? That's what allows us to find the pathway towards rebuilding. Now, I think what's so interesting about this whole idea is that it really gives us a window into what the true nature of our everyday choices are all about. And I want to connect this to something a little bit different, which is an idea that is explored when talking about this concept that comes up in Tanya, that a person has more than one soul, right? They have more than one self, more than one identity. And the Tanya describes that a person has both a nefesh elokis, a godly soul, and a nefesh bahamis, an animalistic soul, a more self-centered soul. And these are two different selves that are sort of wrestling for control over the body. And there's, in later sources in Chabad Chassidus, there's also this notion of a third soul, which is called the nefesh hasichlis, which literally means the rational soul, or it's the soul that really serves as the mediator between the other two souls. It's the part of the person that is human, right? So it's not this sort of godly, otherworldly part of this reality that transcends our physical world, right? It's a very human part of us, but it has the ability to be purely objective and to really seek meaning and truth and purpose outside of our own self-centered interests. And that is why it's able to be a bridge between the other two souls, because it can both relate to the animal soul in its humanness, but also has this ability to appreciate and understand the perspective of the godly soul because it has this objective side to it that's able to seek out truth and meaning beyond itself. Now, there's this really interesting question that comes up in the discussion about these souls, which is who makes the choice, right? We know we believe in free choice in Judaism, but which of the three souls makes the choice between good and evil, right? In our everyday lives, when we're making these moral decisions, which soul actually chooses if there's really three different selves? And it's a really interesting question that's debated, but the answer ultimately, when you get down to it, is somewhat surprising. But the answer is that it's actually the godly soul. And in some ways that actually makes sense if you think about it, because there's discussion, the Gemara talks about this, how the godly soul, right, our neshama, is the one that makes a promise before it comes down into the world that it's going to be a tzaddik, right, that it's going to do the right thing. And it also, the godly soul, or the neshama, is what actually goes up to Shemayim after 120 and receives reward for what it's done down here on earth, right? So there's a lot of sources that sort of indicate that it's really the nefesh elokis, the godly soul, that is really making the choice at the end of the day, right? On a very, very deep essential level. Although experientially we experience the pull of all these different voices, but at its core, the only soul that really has real bechira, right, real ultimate free choice, is the godly soul. And part of that is because it reflects its ultimate source, which is Hashem, which is the only being which has real free choice. So this is like a really interesting thing, because if the godly soul, the neshama, is the one making the choice, then how could a person ever do something wrong, right? How could we ever sin? If the real freedom of choice only comes from the godly soul, there must be a way that people are able to not only choose godliness, because the godly soul we know is consumed with this raging love and passion for Hashem all the time and never can't even imagine being disconnected from its source. So how is it possible that this godly soul, this altruistic, pure, holy, untainted soul can ever choose something that's evil? And the answer, in very short, this is a very nuanced idea, but the answer is that it must be that in some way, the godly soul isn't really choosing to do evil, but it's allowing it to happen, right? Like the godly soul is almost crouching in the corner and allowing itself to be led by the other voices, right? The other forces in the human psyche, right? So it's allowing the nefesh habahamis, the animal soul, to take over and to take the lead in its life. And it's almost like the godly soul sees itself as like a victim, right? It's almost like crouching in the corner and not taking a stand, not like making its voice heard above all the static, not being assertive, not taking leadership within its own psyche to make the decision about what to do next. And that is where all of our choices lie. Right? So it's almost just like a totally different perspective on what our choices are about. Our choices are not about, okay, there's a good side of me and a bad side of me, and I have to choose between them. No, there's this pure altruistic part of me. And the whole decision we're making is, am I going to allow that part of me to shine, to take leadership? Am I going to put the spotlight on that voice and say like, yes, I am the leader of my own psyche. I can take charge. I can make a bold decision. I'm not going to be a victim of all the chaos around me. You know, we know that the body is called a small city, right? So if you think about like the imagery of Yerushalayim being fraught with all this conflict, right? And like Reb Zachariah ben Avkulos is standing at a point where he can say like, yes, there's all this chaos and all this corruption around me, but I'm the leader here and I can take leadership and I could stop this. I can make a decision that's going to stop all this chaos around me from taking over and from leading to this destruction, right? Of course, God forbid to say that Reb Zachariah ben Avkulos was directly causing the destruction through anything evil that he did, right? But no, it's the inaction. It's the not doing anything that allows that evil to flourish. And when our own inner tzaddik, right, which is our godly soul, our nefesh elokis, our neshama, when we don't give it that voice, when we don't empower it and give it leadership within our own selves, within our own psyche, and empower it to be able to make the choice that it needs to make, that's the pathway to destruction, right? That's the pathway to our own inner korban, right? And on the flip side, the way to rebuild from destruction, the way to move towards what Mashiach is all about is really focusing and empowering that nefesh elokis, that godly soul, that pure innocent voice. And again, when we recognize that it's just about giving leadership and confidence to that part of ourselves, it makes the whole battle so much less overwhelming and scary, right? Because it's like our nefesh elokis is already the leader. It just needs to stand up and step into that voice. So I think this whole story of Reb Zachariah really gives us a really powerful imagery for what our own internal everyday choices look like and what it means to not crouch into the mindset of a victim of our surroundings. And again, not just surroundings like outside of us, but even our own inner conflicts, right? Not to feel like we're a victim of those, but to have a sense that we can take leadership and take a stand to challenge them. One final point that I want to bring in here is from a really beautiful sicha. So that mimer from Basil Gandhi that I just spoke about, where the Rebbe kind of brought in this idea from the Gemara and spoke about how that's, on the flip side, we can also use it as a pathway for rebuilding. There's a really beautiful discussion from that same Farbrengen, where the Rebbe was speaking, where he spoke about this idea that, how does this, okay, we've explained why humility can be really detrimental, why this could be the fatal flaw that leads to destruction. But we also know that humility is so valued, right, in Yiddishkeit. So like, how do we bring those two together, right? Like there's a lot of discussion about how humility is the ultimate virtue, right? So there still seems to be some sort of like paradox that's being described here. If humility can both be like the ultimate value and also be a fatal flaw. What he describes here is that really these two qualities are only contradictory when we look at them more superficially, right? So the way they're expressed in a more superficial way, then it might seem like, okay, so confidence means like I'm asserting myself as the leader over others, right? So like I'm putting myself in a certain pedestal, right? While humility is this ability to kind of, it's this equalizer, not focusing that attention on myself in that way. But he says, really at its core, when you get to the core of pride, of confidence, and humility, they're actually one and the same, right? Essential pride and humility, that's not essential pride and confidence. That's not a confidence or assertiveness over others. But in who I am essentially, that is exactly the same thing as humility, right? The two of them are actually one and the same. And he explains that at the core of who we are in our essence, we're able to hold paradox. We're able to hold absolute humility and absolute confidence at the same time. And those two things don't conflict with each other at all. They actually go hand in hand. So I hope this idea resonated with you and that it gave you a little bit of a sense of meaning and a path forward as we're going into the 3 weeks for what is this time period trying to teach us? How can we look at the story of the destruction that we're mourning during this period as not just a history from the past, but as a guide for how we rebuild in the future? And really give us a sense of awareness of like where we've experienced this type of destruction within our own personal individual journeys and what the pathway to build and move forward would be for all of us.